Welcome, and thank you for attending the Bipartisan Policy Center's latest webinar, Election Legitimacy in Peril, Where Do We Go From Here? My name is Matthew Weil, and I am the director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is hosting today's session. The last 3.5 years have seen an explosion of work done to improve the integrity, security, and thus the legitimacy of American elections. This all follows from documented cases of intentional foreign interference in the voting process in 2016. After that, Congress appropriated $805 million in election security grants. That money, though, was focused on building capacity, repelling future cybersecurity attacks, and hardening physical security of polling places. Then the COVID-19 pandemic hit earlier this year, and with it comes many additional concerns related to the legitimacy of US elections. In the CARES Act, Congress appropriated an additional $400 million in security grants to address those new concerns of legitimacy in elections during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a rockstar panel today, and I want to get to them as soon as possible. Before I do, though, I want to note that if you're following us on our Zoom feed, you can ask questions that we will pose to the panelists later this afternoon. We hope to start that in about 35 minutes, but you can submit those questions throughout the discussion. And with that, Jena Griswold is Colorado's Secretary of State and has been since 2019. She is currently the country's youngest Secretary of State. Secretary Griswold has practiced law and has worked for the Colorado Governor's Office in Washington, D.C. She has a BA from Whitman College and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania. Frank LaRose is Ohio's 51st Secretary of State, and he took office a week after Secretary Griswold. He spent the 2 terms before that in the Ohio State Senate, where he focused on election administration and regulatory reform. Secretary LaRose enlisted in the 101st Airborne and served as a Green Beret. He graduated from The Ohio State University. Our moderator for today's event is Galen Druk, who is the host and producer of 538's Politics Podcast, which aims to explain politics through a mix of data analysis and traditional reporting. He's worked there since 2015. Before that, he helped to create a daily news magazine show on Wisconsin Public Radio, which covered regional news and politics. He is a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University. Galen, with that, I turn the panel over to you.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I should say, we were originally planning on having this conversation at South by Southwest before this pandemic even hit. Of course, South by Southwest didn't happen. But even then, I had a ton of questions that I was excited to ask about election integrity. Now we have even more. And of course, I'm talking about voting amidst a pandemic. So I think we should start with that and then get into some of the foreign interference questions. But just to start off, Secretaries Griswold and LaRose, I want to get a sense of what keeps you up at night. What is the #1 biggest challenge you feel like you're facing in Colorado and Ohio going into this fall election? Secretary Griswold, let's start with you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this. This is almost as good as South by Southwest, and I'm sure we will shine today. So thanks for still doing this. I would say I have 2 major concerns. The first is the undermining of confidence in our election by some elected officials. We know that mail ballots are the best way that Americans can vote during a pandemic. And Colorado has a long history of successfully and securely administering mail ballot. But we are seeing the rhetoric grow quite strong out of the White House, and that's concerning. And the second part, I would say, sometimes it seems that we only focus at one crisis at a time, but there is indeed 2 crises happening right now. The one is administering a presidential election during a healthcare crisis. And the second is the constant undermining of our democracy by Russia and other foreign nations. So I'm just really proud of Colorado's leadership, both in terms of cybersecurity and access to voting during a pandemic. But I do think that we have to quickly address both of those to make sure that Americans can cast their vote and have confidence in our November elections.
Yeah, I definitely want to dig into some of those practices that maybe other states and leaders can learn from. But Secretary LaRose, what keeps you up at night when it comes to administering elections?
Yeah, thanks, Galen. I echo my friend Secretary Griswold. It would have been great to be at South by Southwest, but this is a great alternative. And thanks to you and thanks to BPC for putting this on. The thing that keeps me up at night is my three children. Candidly, I've got a 4, a 6, and an 8-year-old, and I think that they're all three nocturnal. But in all seriousness, prior to this pandemic, the things that most occupied my thoughts were maintaining the confidence of Ohio's voters. And broadly speaking, I think that's one of my most important jobs. I think that's one of our most important jobs as chief elections officers. I wrote something on the wall in our chief of staff office here just next door months ago that said basically a sort of simple mission statement that I think all of us are focused on. And that is, when Ohioans go to bed on election night, whether their candidate wins or their candidate loses, they should be able to go to sleep confident knowing that what they saw, whether it was at the bottom of their screen or on their smartphone or wherever they're consuming information, what they saw is the true reflection of the will of the voters of Ohio, and accept that the people have spoken. Now, to that end, what we focused on all of last year was working to make Ohio a leader in cybersecurity. We instituted a very aggressive program for all 88 of our county boards of elections, and pushed a lot of federal funding that we received from the Help America Vote Act out to our counties. All 88 of my counties now in Ohio have undergone this long checklist of things that I gave them to do to make sure that we're ready for cybersecurity. That was when we were talking about a different kind of virus, right? We were talking about computer viruses. Now we're thinking about the biological kind, but also combating foreign disinformation. And where it's particularly insidious is when it causes people to not want to vote. And we've seen some of that targeted at our minority communities. I've done a series of conversations around the state and continue to now virtually with minority community leaders so that they can learn how to recognize disinformation so that we can combat it. We've stood up a election night, election day, sort of war room environment in our office where we can track disinformation and then combat it, because the best antidote to a lie is the truth. And so if we can get the truth out there by partnering with our media partners and others to amplify that message, then that's time well spent. And then, of course, now, certainly in the last few months, the thing that we've been thinking about a lot, and I continue to think about, is making sure that we're ready for November. I'm working with our state legislature to try to make some really minor changes, quite honestly, to Ohio's law so that we can run a normal election this November. That's my goal. Nothing's normal in any of our lives right now. But my goal is that Ohioans have the same 3 choices that they've had for decades. And that is, if they want to, they can vote for, they have a month of early voting in person. They have the opportunity to vote absentee for a month, which Ohioans have had for nearly 2 decades. And if they don't choose either of those, then they'll have the opportunity to vote in person at a convenient neighborhood location on election day. I want to deliver those same 3 choices to Ohioans. And again, with a few minor changes, we can do that even in the midst of this pandemic that we all face.
Absolutely. So the interesting part of election administration for political nerds is that the law is different in every state. And so it's different in Colorado and Ohio, but Colorado and Ohio are states that already have significant vote by mail operations. And for the rest of the country, states that don't already have that significant vote by mail option are going to be changing their elections administration pretty quickly in just half a year or less. And so what have the two of you learned about administering an election by mail that other states can learn from? And how large do you expect? Of course, Colorado is universal vote by mail, so that'll be the primary option. But do you also expect it to be the primary option in Ohio? And what are you doing to prepare for that influx? Maybe let's start with Secretary Griswold from your experience administering a universal vote by mail election.
Sure. Well, Colorado has one of the highest democratic access systems in the nation when it comes to elections. The fact that we have online voter registration, in-person early voting, same-day voter registration, and that we mail a ballot to every registered voter, I think really shines in stark contrast to a lot of what we see across the country. And then I was very proud last year to run one of the largest democracy reforms in the nation. We did campaign finance, lobbyist reform, a lot of other things. But when it comes to voting, I added drop boxes and polling locations across the state. For the first time ever, we're guaranteeing either a polling center or a drop box on all of our public universities and tribal lands. We looked at some of the ways that minority groups are suppressed and did the opposite. So we worked with all of our tribes to work on native voting on tribal lands. We ran parolee reenfranchisement, automatic voter registration that just went live 2 weeks ago, and across the board, just increased access. Coloradans really like to vote their mail ballot. In our presidential primary, which is on Super Tuesday, we had the highest turnout in the nation, and 97.5% of Coloradans voted their mail ballot. So we expect people to continue to do that. You do see more in-person voting when it comes to the general. So we're going to be prepared to do two things. The first is make sure that we're reminding Coloradans to vote their mail ballot. We're going to be pushing engagement on that. And then also making sure that our in-person voting is safe and secure. So we actually have a statewide primary on June 30th. I just issued election rules to how to vote in person and process ballots safe during COVID. That includes following healthcare guidelines, temperature checks, social distancing at polls. I'm very happy to supply paid sick leave for election judges and also increase the pay. And we're pushing election judge recruitment. We just announced that yesterday. So, I do think that we'll continue to have just great elections. And one of the things that we really want to do is be a resource for the rest of the nation. 36 states have some type of mail ballot. They just call it absentee ballot. So we do have the ability to scale up very quickly. And my office has been a resource to the nation about how to do that. We've been working both on federal legislation to make sure that if federal legislation does move forward, it moves forward in a way that is designed for state success. And then we're just also working one-on-one with other states about the lessons we've learned and how to scale up very quickly to make sure that you have secure mail ballots.
Yeah, Secretary LaRose, you're going from, in some elections, 20% vote by mail in Ohio to, who knows, it could be somewhere in the range of 90% more. You have to be prepared for a surge. How are you going about preparing for that right now?
You're right to mention that Ohio already has high volumes of absentee voting. That's a strength. That's one of the reasons why states like Ohio and Colorado are well prepared to weather this current storm. I sympathize with the states that do not have what they call no-fault absentee voting, which effectively just means that in many states you have to have an excuse to vote by mail. It's very hard to stand up that system in the short time frame. I've got a countdown clock over my shoulder here that says I've got 131 days until early voting starts in Ohio. This would normally not be a time when you want to make big changes to the way that you do elections administration. Certainly, that can have an impact on voter confidence and cause confusion and that kind of thing. But in the midst of this pandemic, there are changes that we have to make. Again, thankfully in Ohio, what we're looking at are minor changes. When a board of elections in Ohio normally gets 20 or 25% of their ballots already coming in by mail, that's scalable. We can scale that up with additional equipment, with additional personnel, and be ready for the expected higher volumes. I anticipate at least double what we have seen will come by mail. And that'll just be what Ohioans choose to do because it is, of course, their option. What I'm trying to do is get our state legislature to authorize me to spend the federal dollars that have already been allocated through the CARES Act and the Help America Vote Act to bring to bear those resources. This came from my time in the Army. One of my pet peeves was always when those of us out on the front lines doing the real work didn't have all the equipment we needed, but you go back to the headquarters where everybody lives in the air conditioning all day and they seem to have the newest, best stuff. I always said, if I'm in a position of authority, I'm going to make sure that resources get out to where the actual work gets done. And in this context, that is the boards of elections. So I'm trying to surge additional funding to them for equipment and personnel to be ready for the impact of higher vote by mail. But the other thing is that we need to modernize the system. The one thing that I'd say that Ohio does need to modernize is the way that you request your absentee ballot. I know that in Colorado, they send everybody a ballot, whether they ask for one or not. In Ohio, our system requires you to request it, but it should be easier to request it than it is now. And that's why I've been trying to create online absentee ballot request. We've had online voter registration in Ohio for many years. I wrote that legislation when I was in the Senate. And in fact, 5 years ago, when I was in the state Senate, I started pushing for online absentee ballot requests. It's time that we do that. And I'm working with our friends across the street in the state legislature to try to get them to authorize that. One of the other things, and Jenna mentioned this, is drop boxes. We have them in all 88 counties. I'd like to see more of them. I'd like to also see postage paid on our absentee ballot envelope returns. That way, effectively, any post box, any mailbox in the state becomes a ballot drop box, right? And so even with all of that, we know that there are people that just prefer to vote by in person, that want to vote in person. And by the way, in some of our minority communities, or certainly among the homeless, it may be more challenging to vote by mail, or among disabled Ohioans, it may be more difficult to vote by mail. So we want to make sure that there is an in-person option available, both for early voting, which in Ohio lasts a whole month, and for election day. And again, if we start now, we can mirror some of the same smart things that retailers, grocery stores, restaurants have done to make sure that we create a safe and healthy environment, both for our poll workers and for our voters. But again, I need the authorization to start spending those funds right now from the state legislature so that we can be ready for that this November.
So given that you both come from states that have significant vote by mail capacities, what would you suggest to other states who aren't in a similar situation to do, or lessons learned from challenges your state has had administering vote by mail? How do you get on track to get this right if you aren't already voting by mail? For example, I'm in New York right now. We don't have no excuse absentee voting by mail as part of our elections historically.
I'll field that first, and then Frank, you're up first next time, if that works.
Gotcha.
I would just say the fundamental driver has to be the ideal that no American should have to choose between risking their health and casting their ballot. Our fundamental right to vote does not dissipate during times of crises. They remain intact. So I do think it's incumbent and imperative on election officials and all elected officials to make sure that Americans have the type of access that they need during a pandemic. And very luckily, we know how to conduct elections during a pandemic. It's expanding vote by mail and making sure your in-person voting is safe. Wisconsin should be a wake-up call for the nation. Milwaukee alone, 180 polling locations were whittled down to just 5. There was long lines, people got sick, there was horrific turnout. And what we cannot allow is the pandemic to be used to suppress voter turnout. We need a certain level of turnout for the legitimacy of the elections. So I believe in American exceptionalism. We have 5 months to figure out how to mail something to every eligible American and have them mail it back and process it. We can do it. And there's 3 simple things that states can do that are starting from either scratch or a lower amount of mail ballots. First is to start their relationship with a print vendor immediately so that they have someone to print all the mail ballots. I know that sounds, well, how hard is that? But no, they have to start right now. The second thing is the tabulation, the processing of those ballots. A lot of Eastern states and Midwestern states are still voting precinct level. If you try to put a processing equipment in every precinct, you're gonna fail. So you have to centralize it. So centralized tabulation, centralized processing so that we can mount this very quickly. And the third is making sure that there's guardrails so that Americans have faith in the elections, and that includes signature verification. Every single state has signatures in their state systems, most often at the DMV. And we can build these systems to be able to signature verify very quickly. Maryland is doing it as we speak. They are building a system to be able to do a mail ballot election, and we can do this as a nation. But it does take leadership, and I'm just really happy to see my friend in Ohio, Frank LaRose, really take the bull by the horns and make sure that he's moving forward. But as a nation, we have to demand that of all of our elected officials to make sure that our democracy remains strong in November.
Thanks, Jenna. And, for the states that are just beginning this journey that Colorado and Ohio and many other states have been on for a long time, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, a little bit of patience. We've gotten accustomed to this idea that by, middle of the evening on election night, we're going to know all the results. Election night reporting may take a little longer when we're processing high volumes of vote by mail. Jenna's right about relationships with vendors and having enough envelopes and printed material. Also working with the Postal Service. Listen, the U.S. Postal Service is under a lot of strain right now. I think we all know that. And we've had some real severe inefficiencies in Ohio that have led to ballots being delayed and in some cases not even being able to be counted because they arrive at the Board of Elections after the deadline. And so working with the Postal Service and also setting realistic deadlines for when you can request a ballot and when they are sent in and that kind of thing. In Ohio right now, one of the other things I'm trying to improve is we allow people to request their absentee ballot up until the Saturday before Election Day. And really all that does is encourages procrastination. And it causes people to receive their ballots a day or two after the election, which is obviously too late to cast one. And so I'm trying to move that up to just conform with the logistical realities of how long it takes the mail to arrive. Things that a lot of times people don't necessarily think of, like the sizes of envelopes, and when you have ballots that are folded up, they have to be flattened out before they can run through the scanners. We've had some boards of elections that have come up with some real creative solutions. There's one that built this like press. They took like a 10-ton hydraulic press and they literally stack the ballots up in it and press them down to flatten them out so they run through the machines and don't jam as much. Those are smart, creative solutions. And for our smaller counties, something as simple as $1,000 machine that cuts open envelopes so that they're not sitting there with letter openers, literally opening envelopes. $1,000 machine that cuts open envelopes can make a big difference in your efficiency. Galen, you've done great work in your podcast talking about the history of really resiliency and innovation in American elections. And really, we've run elections during crises before. We will run a fair and free election this year, but it'll be those elections officials at the local level to get that done. And as much as Jenna was talking about the idea of centralizing, we have a largely decentralized, but it's not decentralized all the way out to the precinct level. In Ohio, it's decentralized to the county level. And so all 88 counties are overseen by a 4-member board. The Board of Elections is 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And in a time where in Washington, it seems like Republicans and Democrats can't agree what day of the week it is, there's a bipartisan success story in that each Board of Elections, at least in Ohio and in many other states, runs as a bipartisan enterprise where Republicans and Democrats come to work every morning and do this really complex, high-stakes work together as a team. That level of decentralization works well for us, and we're trying to increase their capacities and capabilities so that they're ready for the rush that's going to be coming in just over 131 days.
So as viewers can tell, a big part of election integrity during a pandemic is seemingly mundane things like printing and mailing and opening ballots, but ultimately Americans' faith in our results is going to rely in part on that. But really, there are 2 buckets here when it comes to faith in elections. One is making sure that the election, there's actually integrity, right? The process goes smoothly. There's no foreign interference. People who want to vote can vote. And then there's a second bucket, which is making sure that once that fair and free election is held, the public trusts that it was fair and free, and both the winner and loser accept the result as valid. So right now we're in a situation where President Trump is frequently saying that vote by mail enhances people who would defraud our election's ability to do so, and essentially undermining trust in vote by mail, which, as we've discussed, is going to be an important part of voting during a pandemic. How, given that the politician with the biggest platform in the country is making those statements, do you talk to the public and make sure that they actually trust vote by mail, that they want to vote by mail, and that they know that a result based on vote by mail can be trusted? So go ahead, Secretary LaRose.
Yeah, Galen, I'll take that one because Jenna asked me to. So it's there are challenges with that. Listen, I think that, like many things, the public policy conversation around how we vote is being oversimplified by some folks. And some people say that voting by mail is the best thing since pockets and everybody should do it. And other people are saying that vote by mail is a terrible idea and nobody should do it. And those are both sort of vast oversimplifications of it. The fact is that if vote by mail is done well, it can be a good, convenient, secure, safe option for people to cast a ballot. If it's done poorly, it can lead to problems, logistical and fraud problems and everything else. I know that in Colorado, I know that in Ohio, we've put safeguards in place. We maintain accurate voter rolls. We require people to authenticate who they are with a name and an identification number when they request a ballot. The signatures have to match. We have ballot tracking so that individuals can track when it's been requested, just like you would track a package you order online. So that's kind of a crowdsourcing way where the voter can take some responsibility to maintain the security of their actual ballot. And this may be controversial, but I know that in some states, they allow party operatives or activists to collect ballots and deliver them to the boards of elections. Some have called this process ballot harvesting. We don't allow that in Ohio. I think it's superfluous anyway. If you have postage paid envelopes and you have drop boxes, you don't need a partisan activist to be coming and picking up ballots. It has led to documented cases of fraud in other states like North Carolina, where it was a member of my party who was convicted of fraud for that. And so, if it's not needed, then why open the door to that? And so we don't allow that in Ohio, but there are a lot of very convenient ways to return your ballot without putting it in the hand of somebody who may or may not be trustworthy. The president is looking at the whole nation and all 50 states. I can only speak for Ohio. I can tell you that the concerns that he raises are not valid in Ohio, and we address those concerns. And by the way, vote by mail, absentee voting, whatever you want to call it, has been widely accepted in Ohio by both Republicans and Democrats for nearly 20 years. And it's not had any appreciable benefit from one party or the other. I think that far too often there's this tendency to say, well, if this happened when I introduced online voter registration in Ohio. A lot of people got out their crystal balls and tried to figure out this is going to hurt one party or help the other. It ends up being not true. I sincerely believe that people that want to vote for a Republican are going to vote for a Republican. People that want to vote for a Democrat are going to vote for a Democrat, regardless of the methodology of how you do that. And these things that improve convenience and security and make it easier for voters don't have any benefit to one party or the other. So voter confidence is paramount. It's one of my most important responsibilities. I know Jenna feels the same way. And so I work to just tell Ohioans the truth about how vote by mail, how absentee voting works in Ohio, and that they should be confident in that process.
And I would just add on to that I to answer your question very directly, I think it's really sad. I think it's sad when the highest elected official has a bully pulpit and uses it for his own political means. I think the great thing about President Trump is he told us exactly why he opposes the expansion of mail ballot. He said that he believes that it will hurt Republicans' ability to win seats. And not only is that reprehensible for forcing Americans to risk their health to cast a ballot when we have better ways to do it, it's also just untrue. There's study after study, like Secretary LaRose mentioned, where really mail ballots don't benefit any one party over the other. What they do benefit is American voters. And if we are still in a high spread of COVID-19 or even moderate in November, Republicans, Democrats, and independents all alike will be faced with the question, do I want to risk my health to vote? And that's really putting them in an unfair place. Colorado is proof of how you have very successful mail ballot systems. We have a lot of the safeguards like Secretary LaRose is describing, signature verification, bipartisan election teams, rules about how many ballots you can collect. But we also have the highest percentage of eligible people registered in the nation, and we continuously lead the nation in turnout. And there was a study a couple of weeks ago that showed that when we started to send a ballot to every registered voter, our turnout increased by 9%. And it increased, by the way, in African-American communities by 13%, Latino communities by 10%, and Asian Americans communities by 11%. Youth turnout increased by 16%. So I just think it's the right thing to do. And we all have to push back on false narratives to make sure that Americans can continue or will continue to have confidence in our elections.
Galen, let me add something to that. I think that for too long, there's been this tired old notion that somehow high levels of participation are a bad thing for my party. And I just don't see that on the ground in Ohio. I can tell you that it's not true in my estimation. I think that, when we compete in the arena of ideas, that we win elections based on how we govern. But I think that in Ohio, if you look at the facts, we had the highest turnout election in our state's history ever, bar none, in 2016, highest turnout ever. 2018 was the highest turnout election in a gubernatorial year in our state's history. I anticipate 2020 will again be another record year. And in both 16 and 18, Republicans did very well in Ohio. And really, other than a few minor examples, really had kind of sweep years in Ohio with that kind of high level of participation. So I reject this notion that somehow high levels of participation bodes poorly for my party, because it just hasn't proven itself to be true in Ohio.
And this kind of comes back to a similar theme, which is you have the reality, you have the empirical evidence, and then you have voters' perceptions. And you may be able to say that it doesn't have any influence, we have a robust system that won't lead to any fraud, but what do you have to do in order to get the public to believe that? I mean, is that your responsibility as the secretaries of state of your states? How do you enhance voter trust in the process? Because that's ultimately what our democracy hinges on. We'll go back to you, Secretary Griswold.
Well, we have high levels of confidence in our system, and I would say that the process leads to confidence. The fact that we have a voter verified paper ballot, none of our voting equipment is connected to the internet, and we actually do secure builds of all of our voting equipment for people who choose to vote on a piece of equipment. And that we do a risk limiting audit, which is basically in the weeds audit, but that proves to a statistical degree of confidence that our election results are correct, sets the stage for that confidence. So, you know, Coloradans, registered voters, have been receiving mail ballots since 2014. Republicans have swept with that system. Democrats have swept. Both parties have turned out. Independents and unaffiliated have majorly turned out. And our system works. You know, we have all the safeguards in place, and I can go over it, but you're exactly right. You can have the best process in the world, and that's what, as Secretary of State, we really should be pushing towards, having processes that lend to confidence. But it's more than just that. It's outside forces, other government officials and leaders talking about the experiences of voting. So, for example, when we all know, and it's fact, that Russia tried to attack our elections in 2016 and continues to do so, when there's a lack of a big federal response, it makes it harder for states to convince their constituents. You know, I'm very proud that Colorado is at the forefront of cybersecurity. And we have actually partnered with Secretary LaRose on several things to not only protect our elections, but also to make sure that our citizens know that we are doing, everything, often for the first time in the nation, to make sure that our elections are secure. But the same can be said with mail ballots. We set up an incredibly good system. We have years of experience that show not only how that the system leads to very accessible elections, but also some of the securest elections in the nation. And I just think it's a disservice that we have that narrative out there right now, trying to undermine all of our great successes, and what it's going to do, and what its intent very well could be is to suppress the vote. And we have to remember the national narrative is not just in a vacuum of a healthcare crisis. It's in a historical context of increased voter suppression across the nation. You just have to look to Florida, to the suppression of students, or Texas, Georgia for African Americans, North Dakota for Native Americans. Some of the Supreme Court's action to see the attack on voting rights is alive and well. And that, unfortunately, will not stop during the pandemic. So everybody who believes in Americans' fundamental rights really needs to stand up and demand that all of us have access to the ballot box, and we have confidence that our ballots are counted accurately and correctly.
Thanks for the question, Galen. I think that, again, the simple idea that the best antidote to false information is truth, and lots of it. And I think that there's, unfortunately, this human capacity for great creativity as it relates to elections, conspiracy theories. People, for some reason, come up with a lot of really creative ideas that they believe are true, and the facts just don't bear that out. We do a lot of myth busting kind of work in our office to push back on ideas that for some reason are still pervasive out there that people have. We've also organized a series of the disinformation workshops that I talked about. And by the way, and I'll disagree on one point with my friend from Colorado about the administration's seriousness on this. I would say that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has been a great partner on combating disinformation. Again, I can't ask for anything more than what they've been offering us, including their participation in the disinformation briefings that I've offered for our minority communities to help empower them to recognize this kind of thing and combat it. And so from the classified briefings that I get on down to the public information effort that DHS does, I think that they're taking this matter seriously, as we are. I've compared this to a fight within the family. You know, we'll have our fights between Republicans and Democrats, and we can have those debates. But when somebody outside the family messes with us, we all need to come together as a family and not tolerate that. And that's the way I've viewed foreign disinformation operations. It will not be tolerated in Ohio, I can tell you, and I take that very seriously. One of the other things that we've done is really tried to partner with members of the media. They have an important platform. There's a reason why the founders created the very First Amendment to protect the free press. And that was, none of them could have imagined that we would be communicating the way we are right now, but they knew that an informed electorate was key to the functioning of a democracy. And so I've found that a number of journalists that I know are very dedicated to getting the facts straight. They want to get the story out. They want it to be accurate. They need to get it out quickly because there's always pressure on them as far as deadlines. But most of them are not elections experts. They've never worked behind the counter at the Board of Elections. Many of them have never been a poll worker. And so for reporters that are writing about elections administration, we've tried to empower them by doing a series of briefings around the state that I just call Elections 101. And it's kind of like a brown bag thing. Bring your own lunch. We're going to invite you to the County Board of Elections. We're going to give you a tour, show you the machines that scan ballots. We'll even do a mock election where everybody gets to vote for their favorite flavor of ice cream, and you can sort of follow through the process, how that gets tabulated. And then we go through sort of combating some of the disinformation. Other thing is just full transparency. There is no secrets. There can be no secrets in elections, even to the point where we were the victim of a cyber attack last year. Thankfully, we were able to fight it because of the safeguards that we put in place, and we won. The good guys won, the bad guys lost. We successfully fought off a cyber attack on election day last year. And my first comment to the folks at DHS was, tell me within a couple of days if this is classified or not. Because in my old world as a Green Beret in the Special Forces, I recognize why we need to protect classified information, to protect the people that gather it and everything else. But if it's not classified, it's public. It's binary. It's only one of the two. It's either classified or it's public. And when they came back and said, this is not classified, we're not going to classify this, I immediately turned it over to the press in Ohio to make sure that they could report on it, because voters deserve to know about these kind of things. Finally, community partners. It's no secret that there has been tension in the past between my office and voting rights advocates. In some cases, there's been litigation. I took a very different approach when I took this office. I sat down with the NAACP and the A. Philip Randolph Institute and the League of Women Voters. And I've joked that we may as well give them one of those magnetic card keys to get into our office, because they're here so frequently. We meet with these folks all the time because they care about elections and voter rights, and I care about elections and voter rights, so we should be working together. And when we had to move quickly to transition Ohio's primary to this new sort of pandemic way of voting, we worked with over 150 of these clergy groups, unions, business groups, nonprofits, anybody that you could think of, to try to get the word out. And that was a powerful partnership. Those folks helped amplify our message simply because we sat down with them. We don't agree on everything, but we engaged, and they helped get the word out to their communities that they serve.
Absolutely. So I want to mention to anybody who's watching that you can ask questions, and we will get to those in just a minute. So for the last question here, I do want to drill down on what this conversation was going to be originally about, which was largely foreign interference in our elections. And so it's a plethora of ways that this could happen. We've already mentioned some of them, from misinformation online to hacking the Secretary of State's website and meddling with not the actual results, but the display of the results, to, and God forbid, actually interfering in the tallying of Americans' votes. So how have you tried to, mitigate these threats in your prospective states? And do you think at this point, can you, say with confidence that you are ready for Election Day 2020 and that there will be no foreign interference in your state's elections? Or if there is interference, it will not undermine the integrity of your state's vote? Let's start with you, Secretary Griswold.
Sure. Happy to start. So I can say confidently that we have confidence in our election results. First and foremost, you can't hack a paper ballot. It's just that simple. We are the old school state. Even if you vote in person, you have a voter verified paper ballot. My team, we have a security team that goes and does a secure build of all of our voting equipment for the very small percentage of Coloradans who will vote on equipment in a general, which is about 2%. And then we do those audits afterwards that shows us to a statistical degree of confidence that our results are correct and that we would find anything that went well or wrong, excuse me. We also find things that go well all the time. But I would say, there's a lot of election support systems that need to be protected. A statewide voter registration system, online voter registration, election night reporting, and that list is continuous. And Colorado has been on the forefront of cybersecurity innovation for a while under the previous administration, and we doubled down under my administration. We were the first state to do two-factor authentication. We were the first state to do a risk limiting audit, the first state to do a statewide tabletop exercise, which is basically an election disaster exercise where everything that you think could go wrong goes wrong every 30 seconds to really train folks. We do penetration testing where we actually hire outside vendors to try to break into our system. And we have over 40 people dedicated onto our IT security team. And we have our own standalone security team. And the list goes on, whether it's in our contracts, building in provisions under my administration to do penetration testing on our vendors, to a whole array of things. I will say that the untruths about elections are more dangerous now because they get amplified in disinformation campaigns. And disinformation campaigns it's not just someone standing on the corner saying something is wrong. It's the new form of voter suppression. It's foreign countries actively trying to suppress the votes or trick American voters in casting their ballots. And we should be very concerned about that. We are also seeing a new wave of election attacks. Not only is there disinformation, not only is there attacks directly on election infrastructure, there's an uptick in ransomware attacks over the last year and a half, where you will have a county network. And by the way, in Colorado and a lot of the nation, the actual election administration is done at the county level. So you'll have a treasurer's office or an assessor's office attacked in a small county without a lot of resources that may not have the amount of resources needed to set up firewalls, two-factor authentication, some of the basic cyber needs. So they get into a weak spot and then they start trying to get into the clerk's office. So far in Colorado, we've been very successful at being able to protect all of our clerks' equipment. That's something that we do. But I do think that as a nation, we need to always focus on updating our preventions. That's why I have a package to combat disinformation that includes campaign finance and straight disinformation provisions, including things like deep fakes. That's also why I've been leading the way to create a statewide cybersecurity platform to be able to give out grants and help our counties with standards, even on offices and equipment that is not election equipment, because everything interfaces. And that's why also I've been working very closely with DHS. And I do agree with Secretary LaRose, the civil servants at DHS go above and beyond. I was very happy to work with Secretary LaRose. I think it was January or February, we were able to convince DHS to alert us when there were election attacks on our infrastructure, to actually alert the chief election officers, which is me and Secretary LaRose in Ohio. Believe it or not, since 2016, that had not been fixed. We just fixed that. And then I've also have been pushing our intelligence to declassify information on disinformation campaigns, because I totally agree with Secretary LaRose. If I know something is going on but can't roll it out, and we can't roll it out on a bipartisan basis or with a state-federal partnership to Americans, they may not know disinformation campaigns until it's too late. So I do think that's another big opportunity that I will continue to work on to really urge intelligence to declassify. So overall, I do have tremendous amount of confidence in Colorado's election systems, but I'm also very dedicated to increasing our cyber and ability to combat disinformation. And I just really appreciate your guys' focus on this, because this is something that continues to be one of the biggest issues in our national security.
Galen, thank you for starting this conversation by sort of bifurcating these two different ideas, because I think that a lot of people don't realize, and Jenna did a very good job of talking about this too, that the elections infrastructure where ballots are actually cast and counted is very secure. These pieces of equipment are never connected to the internet. They're tested. First of all, before they're ever certified by the Elections Assistance Commission, they're tested in Ohio again by what we call the Board of Voting Machine Examiners. They're run through a full battery of what we call logic and accuracy tests before each election. And then we do a full audit of every election in not most yet, but hopefully someday, many of our counties in Ohio do a risk limiting audit as well. And so throughout that whole process, the voting machines and the tabulation equipment is very secure. Really the only way conceivable that somebody could hack, and this is a word that's sort of overused, but any way that somebody could tamper with the voting equipment is to physically put their hands on it. And in our boards of elections, they're kept behind double lock and key, where the Republicans have one lock and the Democrats have another lock. So you really have to both be there before anybody can get in. And it's largely, it's not inconceivable, but a conspiracy that involved tampering with voting machines would be very quickly uncovered. And in Ohio, as in Colorado, we require a paper trail for every ballot ever cast, and always have been that way. It was shocking to me to find out that there were still states in this country that had purely electronic voting with no paper trail. Ohio has always required that. We audit those after the election to make sure things were honest and came out right. But the security, the cybersecurity of our elections really needs to be focused on those systems that are by nature attached to the internet, have to be voter registration systems. We need to have better standards for voter rolls, the databases that maintain the voter rolls, and that's something that we're pushing at a national level as well as here in Ohio. And then the local level security. Each of our counties now have an Albert sensor, which is effectively sort of a cyber burglar alarm. And thankfully now, because of the work that Secretary Griswold was able to do and that I was able to do, when there is a breach, we get notified immediately instead of just the county getting notified. We also know, so that we can mobilize a team, and we have a response team that goes down to support those counties with how to mitigate and bounce back from attacks like that. And so the cybersecurity is absolutely critical. The reason why is that the cybersecurity is really about maintaining voter confidence, because it's not that our foreign adversaries are going to be able to hack a piece of equipment to change the results of an election. At least that's highly inconceivable or unlikely. But what they can do is, for example, a denial of service attack on a Board of Elections website that replaces the Board of Elections website with some hacker logo. That wouldn't change any votes. It would inconvenience those that are trying to look up their polling location or see what's going to be on their ballot or use the online voter registration portal. It would inconvenience those folks, which is bad enough. But what it would do is unleash all kinds of panic. People would think, oh my God, my Board of Elections has been compromised. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to guard against. And that's why I'm glad to hear what Colorado's doing. In Ohio, we've been very aggressive on this as well. We have a full-time cybersecurity director here, a chief information security officer at our office that we hired recently after a nationwide search for the best person that we could find. But the disinformation is sort of a partner of the cybersecurity, combating disinformation. And think about this: in not too many years ago, we would have had a different name for this. We just called it propaganda, right? This idea that a foreign adversary can create a false narrative and get people to believe something that's not true. I mean, we've engaged in that kind of operation ourselves as Americans with trying to influence the public opinion of a foreign power and that kind of thing. The problem is it's gotten so insidious because it can be so well targeted now. We all carry propaganda delivery devices with us on a daily basis, and instead of flying over the countryside and dropping out leaflets, which is kind of the old school way of doing propaganda, you can micro target propaganda to people that specifically goes after the things that they care about, and that's why it's so important that we combat this kind of thing. Foreign disinformation is a reality. We have to fight against it. It cannot be tolerated. And to answer your question, I am confident that we have the right things in place in Ohio, not to prevent it, because they will try to engage in foreign disinformation. And candidly, where I'm most alert to that right now is that it's right out of the Russians' playbook, for that matter, the North Koreans and the Iranians and others, to use an existing emergency, such as the one that we're in right now, to exploit existing fears and to sow division. And this is why particularly, and really the ugly thing that they do is to try to target some of our minority communities and try to inflame existing tensions that exist in an effort to get people not to vote, to in fact cause them to self-disenfranchise, which is the ugliest thing that one could imagine. And that's why we have to combat this and fight against it with everything we have. We're making a solid effort on that in Ohio. We can't prevent foreign adversaries from doing this, but what we can do is blunt their efforts and make them fall on deaf ears and be ineffective.
All right, so we have a lot of questions here, so I'm going to try to cruise through them and maybe just ask each question to either of you. So let's start with a question from Zach. And in essence, it's about verifying absentee ballots and whether or not ballots are thrown out because of a signature match once the ballot has been cast. And I know that this is a question that gets asked a lot because sometimes there is an imbalance in the race or age, et cetera, of the voters whose ballots are thrown out based on their signature. So how do you ensure that people are not needlessly disenfranchised because their signatures don't match on an absentee ballot?
That's a really great question, because we do see a higher mismatch of signatures for younger people because they happen to have less signatures in our database. So one of the things that Colorado does is allow a 7-day cure period where the county clerks are actually required to send a letter, and then campaigns can also go track down those voters. And one of the things that I'm very happy to do with some of the CARES money is to basically build a platform that's an electronic cure. In cure, that's just a fancy way of saying fix your signature. So basically, a Coloradan could sign and take a picture and upload it, which makes it a little easier to do that very quickly. Signature verification does play a very important role. We use that to really make sure that the people who are voting that ballot are who they say they are. It's verified by bipartisan teams of judges, and any time where there is a discrepancy and that cure is not made, we do refer those to the Attorney General. I do want to underline that is extremely rare, and there's study after study that shows that any type of voter fraud or election fraud is incredibly rare. And we're really happy to be able to offer that cure mechanism, because we want Coloradans to be able to, number one, vote securely, and we do that in part by the signature verification. But number two, cure their ballot if that signature is not in the database.
Secretary Griswold thanks, Galen. Secretary Griswold did a great job of answering that, and I echo a lot of it. I mean, in fact, Ohio has virtually the same process in place. We do signature verification. It is important. It is also not a perfect way to verify people's identity. That signatures can change over time, particularly as people age and that kind of thing. And so it's something that we have to be aware of. We have a cure period as well in Ohio where people can verify that is who they say they are. And we also have the bipartisan oversight, where this is not something that the Republicans on the Board of Elections or the Democrats on the Board of Elections get to make that decision exclusively. That's something that is done as a team. It is an important safeguard. It is not 100% perfect, but it is a good way to make sure that people are who they say they are. And then having that cure period in place is important.
Next question is for you, Secretary LaRose from Collier. The question is, how did emergency powers affect the primary? And what do you think the best practices are for that? What do you wish would have been different about the way that the election proceeded, essentially?
Yeah, so we were in just sort of an unfortunate situation of timing, in that the pandemic was starting to become a much more serious matter to everybody at about exactly the same time Ohio was ready to conduct our election. Leading up to our March 17th Ohio primary, I had been taking my advice from the public health professionals, not only here in Ohio, Dr. Amy Acton, who is the director of our Ohio Department of Health, but also from the federal CDC, And they had been clear all along in daily conference calls I've been having with them that it would be safe to go forward and conduct an in-person election if we followed their guidelines for social distancing, personal protective equipment, sanitizing and wiping down equipment and that kind of thing. And so because I don't have an MD after my name, I listen to the people that do. And we were preparing to run an in-person election. We had moved over 150 polling locations away from senior centers to protect vulnerable populations. That's a big, difficult thing to do, to move that many polling locations. We had trained and recruited over 3,000 new poll workers in a period of 4 days, which was a huge undertaking. We had a great outpouring of really patriotic support from veterans organizations and community groups and churches saying, all right, here's a bunch of people that'll help you run polls. Ultimately, that guidance changed very late in the game for us. I got a call on Monday morning, March 16th, from our lieutenant governor and our governor here in Ohio, and they said that because of new science out of Europe showing a much higher fatality rate, and because CDC was changing from 100 down to 10, the maximum gathering size, the governor, in his estimation, didn't think that we could go forward with in-person voting in Ohio. Hindsight being 2020, I wish that decision could have been made a lot earlier so that we had time to respond to that. Making that decision with just 24 hours to go is very difficult. I know that many members of our state legislature were concerned by the fact that the governor used his authority under what's called Title 37 in Ohio's law, the public health statute, to prevent the spread of infectious disease. The governor used that authority through the health director to close down in-person voting in Ohio, and that caused some concerns and some litigation. And again, ultimately, the governor had to make the decision that he thought was best for the public health of Ohioans. If there's anything that takes precedent, and very few things do, nothing does. If there's anything that takes precedent to a free and fair election, it's protecting human life. And I think that the governor made a difficult decision to do that. I responded by saying, here's how we should complete this election. And then the legislature weighed in a few weeks later with a very different plan. Decision-making in times of crisis is always prone to second guessing and Monday morning quarterbacking and all that kind of stuff. And I leave it to folks that want to do that. But I'll say that given the sort of crisis situation that we were in, I think that we did the best that we could. And listen, when leaders have to make decisions in the midst of a crisis, often they're faced with choosing between bad and worse. When you get to choose between good and bad, that's an easy choice. When you're faced with bad and worse, that can be a difficult menu of choices to choose from.
Thanks for that. So Secretary Griswold, the next one is for you, and it relates to a different state, but I think every state in the country will have to face a challenge somewhat like this. Edward asks, this morning, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story with this headline: thousands of Pennsylvania voters might not get their mail ballots in time to actually vote. And this specific sentence: some will likely not even receive them until after the election. So what remedies can states take? What would you recommend to avoid this kind of disenfranchisement? And I understand that in Colorado, you already are accustomed to mailing ballots to every voter. In states that don't do this, what do they have to do? You're on mute.
Unmuted. I was just saying, gosh, I didn't see that headline, and I'm so sorry to hear that. I would say in Colorado, we're about to have our statewide primary on June 30th, and ballots go out the week of June 8th. So first and foremost, making sure that your ballots go out on time. We do want them to be delivered, of course. But one of the things that states can do is offer replacement ballots, and we do that. So we have a statewide voter registration database that tracks all the ballots. So if a Coloradan says, oh gosh, I never received it, dog ate my ballot, no problem. We just invalidate that older ballot. It can't be counted even if someone tried to turn it in, and send them a new one. There is a date, and Secretary LaRose mentioned this, about a week beforehand, where we will not put ballots in the mail anymore because we're worried that you're not going to actually receive them. So that's a lot of when we have in-person transactions. And one of the things that we are changing for this upcoming election is how we give replacement ballots after the deadline to mail them has passed. First and foremost, I am encouraging my county clerks to set up curbside delivery of replacement ballots, and we'll cover all those costs. So we want people to stay out of polling centers as much as they can and pick them up on the curb. And if someone can't make it to a polling center for whatever reason, they're like my mom, who's been a frontline worker on a COVID ward as a nurse, and just doesn't want to go to a polling center. We're actually expanding a system that we use to deliver ballots to our overseas and military voters. It is the only end-to-end encrypted system in the nation for delivering electronic ballots abroad. We're going to allow Coloradans to use that. So for people who have a printer at home and they just can't go get their replacement ballot, our county clerks will send them it. They will print it. For people, again, like my mom, who does not have a printer, we will allow Coloradans to use that end-to-end system to both receive their ballot and vote it and send it back to us. So I do think that it's really important that we innovate. And the last thing that states can do is offer in-person election day voting and same-day voter registration. The fact that you are not registered on election day should not affect your fundamental right to vote. That's what I believe. And that's one of the reasons that we have in-person voting, not only for people who need to use voting equipment, but also for younger people or people who are just not registered. And we do a really good job in Colorado on making sure that we have the safeguards, but also promote access. So there's various things that states can do, and we're always there to help any state that wants a helping hand in setting up these systems.
And we're just about out of time, so I'm going to ask the last question of you, Secretary LaRose, and this question comes from Barbara. It's, what does Ohio do in terms of maintaining the health of its voter rolls? How often are you in contact with the different agencies that are responsible for voter registration, maintaining those databases?
Thanks, Galen, and thanks for the question, Barbara. You know, this is one of these things where, unfortunately, voter list maintenance has, I think, in some ways been over-politicized in the last few years. This wasn't previously something that generated a lot of controversy, and really both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state in Ohio have carried out Ohio's process for maintaining the accuracy of the list. Now, think about the enormity of the challenge. It's a dynamic database that's constantly changing by the second. People are turning 18, passing away, moving into the state, moving out of the state, that kind of thing. And so the challenge of maintaining a voter database in Ohio is challenging, and it's also very decentralized in our state. I don't maintain a statewide voter registration database. I wish we could. We have to compile that from each of the county boards of elections, where 88 counties maintain there, and I aggregate those up into one statewide database. And so the maintaining of that is done at 88 counties, and that's something that has led to challenges as well. But specifically, what Ohio has, first of all, we work with a system called ERIC, which is a multi-state collaborative that allows states to compare their voter rolls. We work with the National Change of Address database through the U.S. Postal Service. We work with our State Department of Health. We get a list every month of those that are deceased so that they can be processed for removal from the voter rolls through a very thoughtful, safeguarded process that exists. And also in Ohio, there's a requirement on our state law that requires me to do an annual inspection of the voter rolls and compare it to the list that Ohio Department of Public Safety maintains to remove non-citizens that have become registered to vote. Thankfully, it's usually a tiny number that have become registered to vote through whatever reason, and we remove those. And if those individuals have proven intentionality and actually gone and cast a vote as a non-citizen, then we do refer them for prosecution. It's not a small matter. It's something that we take seriously. Ohio also has a system for maintaining the accuracy of our voter rolls that I think is a little antiquated. It requires the 6-year look back of inactivity. If you go 6 years and miss 12 elections at least where you just don't participate, you don't show up at a Bureau of Motor Vehicles during those 6 years, and you don't respond to the multiple mailings we send you, the assumption is, under the law that was put in place nearly 20 years ago, that the assumption is that you're dead or moved or that it's a duplicate or whatever else. That's kind of an antiquated system. It's what we have. I have to enforce that and carry it out. It has been the subject of litigation that's gone all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Unfortunately, words like purge have been used that sound really scary to people, but really when you talk about removing inaccurate data from the voter rolls, it doesn't quite sound quite as scary. What I'm trying to do is modernize that system, and I've got a bill that I've been promoting at the state legislature to create an automated voter registration system so that we can update that information more frequently, such as when people go into a BMV location right there on the spot. I think that using modern technology, we can do a much better job of maintaining the accuracy of our voter rolls without dropping people from the rolls that have just become infrequent voters, which we don't want anybody to be an infrequent voter, but certainly that shouldn't be the reason why you get dropped from the rolls, in my opinion.
You're muted now, Galen.
Uh-oh, start video again. There we go. We had to have one technological hiccup, otherwise it wouldn't have been a Zoom meeting. Anyway, that is about all the time we have. So thank you so much, Secretaries Griswold and LaRose, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center. We really appreciate it. So hope everyone enjoyed the conversation today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jenna. Thanks, Galen. Thanks, everybody, for your interest.
See y'all later. Thank you, Galen.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
It was great to meet you. Take care
Nice
too.
meeting you too. Be well.